Our presentation is on teenagers' perspectives on racial and gender pay gaps in America, and our mentor is Professor Ashley Lee. Next slide, please. My name is Max, and I go to Millennium High School.
Hello, my name is Crystal, and I'm also from Millennium High School.
Hello, my name is Vicky. I'm from Stuyvesant High School.
Hi, my name is Sylvia Chi, and I'm from Baruch College Campus High School.
Hello, my name is Margie Mancia, and I attend Manhattan Village Academy.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ashwa Lee, and I work at Baruch College, CUNY.
So we decided to focus our research on the pay gap, but first we must understand why it's important. So the Equal Pay Act was in place so that men and women would be given equal compensation for the same work. And Title VII of the Civil Rights Act prohibits discrimination in workplaces based on a person's race or color. Both of these laws ensure equal salary, overtime pay, bonuses, life insurance, vacations, holiday pay, hotel accommodations, and benefits. Although these laws are in place, pay gaps are still an enduring issue due to the loopholes, unfavorable court rulings, and societal stereotypes. For example, employers may argue that a factor other than sex or race is driving the unfair pay, which invalidates the accusations. Furthermore, societal stereotypes such as gender roles and systemic racism can play a huge factor in creating the pay gap. As we can see, pay gaps are still very relevant and detrimental to our society, which is why we should continue to learn more about them. Next slide, please. So the purpose of our study is to examine teenagers' perceived knowledge on racial and gender pay gaps in the United States. We chose this because previous studies have focused on the severity and many other factors that could have caused racial and gender pay gaps, but lack how accurate our perceived knowledge is on these topics, especially within teenagers. So we conducted a study to see how much teenagers actually know about the racial and gender pay gaps in the United States. Next slide, please.
Before we dive into our research, there are a few terms that we need to know. The glass ceiling is a metaphorical term, as the name suggests, a phenomenon where women and minority groups face an invisible barrier that prohibits and or lessens the chances of them being promoted to a higher position within an organization. This goes hand in hand with intersectionality. Next slide, please. Intersectionality refers to a combination of an individual's identity, like gender, race, and sexuality, to name a few, how they affect an individual's treatment, privilege, and disadvantage in the world. For example, having two minority identities can have a double disadvantage effect, like the pay of an African American woman compared to that of a white woman's. The picture on the right provides more factors in intersectionality, and as you can see, there are many factors that do involve, but for the purposes of this study, we will focus on race and gender only. Next slide, please.
Research questions. We wondered whether or not teenagers had accurate perceptions of racial and gender pay gaps in the US. Then we had thought about whether older teens 16 to 19 years old had different perceptions of racial and gender pay gaps than younger teens ages 13 to 15. Another question we had was, do teens with higher awareness of racism and sexism have more accurate perceptions of racial and gender pay gaps than teens with lower awareness of racism and sexism? And our final research question was, does socioeconomic status affect how teenagers perceive racial and gender pay gaps? Next slide, please. Study method. To answer our research questions, we designed an online survey and recruited teenagers whose age range is from 13 to 19 years old. Teenagers were given a series of questionnaires. Specifically, the first section of the survey asked to what extent teenagers agreed with each of the 6 demographic factors, including education background, age, marital status, race, ethnicity, gender, and sexual orientation, contributes to the pay gaps among employees. This type of question was to collect data on how many teenagers actually believe that race, ethnicity, and gender is a primary contributor to pay gaps, in which the majority of our participants are strongly agreed on. In the second section, we set up an example situation where, assuming that 2 people in the same company have the same roles, responsibilities, education, age, and job qualifications, but the only difference is their race and gender. So one is a white man and the other one isn't. This second type of question was asked to measure teenagers' estimated pay per group and the actual statistics of pay gaps between a white man and other racial and gender groups. And in the third section, we asked questions relating to the participants' own awareness of interpersonal racism and sexism. They were asked questions like, some people will treat me differently because I am blank, and they will fill in that blank with their own race, ethnicity, and gender. Finally, teenagers were asked to report the demographics, including age, gender, race, ethnicity, and their own family's socioeconomic status. Next slide, please. Sample characteristics. In total, 59 participants completed our survey. All of our survey participants were teenagers, but the majority of them were ages 16 to 17. Hence, the average age of our participants is 16.40 years old. 67.8% of participants were female, and 25.4% were male, while the rest prefer not to say. As for the race and ethnicity, 39% of responders were Hispanic, 37.3% were Asian, 8.5% were white, and 3.4% were Black.
Our first research question was whether teenagers have accurate perceptions of racial and gender pay gaps in the US. Our study results shows that teenagers generally overestimate the pay gaps among different racial and gender groups. In this table, the actual pay gap statistics are shown in a brown color, and the teenagers' estimated pay gap is shown in the black color. Let's read the result about the black man as an example. We can interpret that the actual statistics show when a white man earns $1, a black man earned 98 cents. However, teenagers estimated that black men were earned 72 cents. Thus, teenagers overestimated the pay gap between a white man and a black man. Same patterns are shown in different racial and gender groups. Moving to our second research question, we wonder whether older teens have different perceptions of racial and gender pay gaps than younger teens because they have more education and are more knowledgeable about the issue. Our result did not show any evidence that the two groups are different, which means that older teens and younger teens have similar perceptions of racial and gender pay gaps. We had assumed that we would see more accurate estimations on pay gaps among the older teens, but the results have shown that this isn't true. Next slide, please. Continuing on, our third research question was to know if teens with higher awareness of racism and sexism will have more accurate perceptions of racial and gender pay gaps than teens with lower awareness of racism and sexism. Interestingly, we found the opposite result. Based on our result, as teens are more aware of racism or sexism, the more inaccurately they perceive a person's earnings. We speculated that this is because as people are more aware of this problem, they may view the wage gap as a bigger issue. The last research question that we looked on was whether teenager socioeconomic status affects their perceptions of racial and gender pay gaps. We thought the socioeconomic status might matter on the perception because we believe that people with higher social status that are not affected by the pay gap will not see a problem in racial and gender pay gaps. However, we found that socioeconomic status was not correlated with the perception of racial and gender pay gaps. Next slide, please.
Our study has several implications to both science and our society. First off, our study is one of the few studies examining how people perceive the pay gaps in different racial and gender groups. Many previous research studies have looked at why the inequality exists, but very few have examined how people actually perceive and estimate the pay gaps. Especially our study focuses on teenagers, those who are vital members of society and will enter the labor market soon. Our study shows that how much teenagers are aware of the disparities in workplaces. Second, based on our findings showing that teens of all ages and socioeconomic statuses tend to have inaccurate perceptions of the pay gaps, we suggest that maybe the education system has not adequately taught about diversity issues and economic inequality among different racial and pay groups. We suggest that schools should teach more about pay gaps often in class and have teenagers discuss about the topic. Next slide, please. Although our study has obtained some real results, we have a few limitations. Participants were selected from acquaintances, really limiting the types of subjects surveyed, for instance, by location. Difficulties may have also emerged from questionnaire phrasing. Many people aren't as mathematically inclined and therefore may be poor at estimation. Next slide, please. These are our references.
We have come to the end of our presentation. Thank you for listening. And if you have any questions about our study, please reach out to us at suhyun.ashley@gmail.com.